Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes, an Iron Scales podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with security leaders and practitioners and other influential InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Cybersecurity Heroes is brought to you by Iron Scales, the most powerfully simple email security platform. And I'm your host, Brendan Rudd. And now, let's get into the show. Hey Karim, welcome to the show.
Hey Brendan, thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule, and it's kind of been a long day for you already, so appreciate you taking. We were just discussing that before you hopped on. You're about, you said 5 or 7 hours behind the East Coast?
Yep, it's 7:51 a.m. right now, and I've been up for about 4 hours, so it's midday and things are going well. But yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me as a guest.
No, you're welcome. And speaking of which, so how is your week going so far?
Just started, but generally, we'll see what kind of surprises this week brings. The last couple of weeks have been nothing short of a movie. For lack of a better term, there's always something new.
Yeah.
This morning, read an article that I'm going to be probably commenting on in the next couple days on Russia's potential de-peering of the internet. They actually are now officially laid out plans for setting up their own TLS certificate authority, which is a very dramatic first step to potential de-peering, which is definitely concerning. We could spend a whole podcast on Russia de-peering from the internet as a risk in a lot of ways. So something to keep our eyes on. But that looks like that might be this week's consuming concerning thing too. So that's where we are today.
Yeah, and I think it will probably tie into my question later on around how the move by the US to remove Russia from SWIFT sort of plays into what you just mentioned now about this decoupling of Russia's infrastructure from the internet.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, if it's not, and we can, again, I don't want to dwell on it too much right now, but it's
Sure.
not too dissimilar to the situation with the Great Wall in China or North Korea's, kind of walled garden internet. They have their own ecosystems. Now, while that seems innocuous to the average user, that, oh, well, who cares if they have their own systems, who cares? Well, there's one major glaring issue, which is that if Russia doesn't need to be tied to the greater internet, then all of us are on becomes more fair game for attacks, because if they're not going to hurt themselves in an attack on it, then why limit themselves? Very similar to the Swift situation that I've commented on a few times with a few other podcasts and interviews, which is, if you don't make it them suffer the consequences of a shutdown of that type of system, which they would if they did it presently because they're part of it. If you take that away from them, which is punishment in theory from a sanction standpoint, it becomes a fair enough. If I can't get milk from the cow, then why not just have a steak? Problem.
Yeah, it brings up the old adage of keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely correct.
Cool. So I guess it's a dumb question to ask what's keeping you up at night.
Oh, I have a list, my friend. Yeah, but there's definitely a priority on that list. I mean, there's definitely a rank and file there, because I think that naturally it's the overarching concept of, okay, when does the other shoe drop, so to speak? When do we start feeling the effects of something maybe that ramificates from the situation with Ukraine come to the US? And as you all know, having gotten to know me a little bit and what we do in Prevailion and what my core competency has been for years, I'm seeing the implants that have been established in these in the country, in the US and other allied nations, that are already there. This is not about Russia. I think this is the general misperception by the general population many times, which is, oh, but what if Russia tries to get inside, and what if they try to attack us and get in now? And it's this idea that they could leverage a vulnerability and get in. And the thing is, it's this idea that they're a few steps behind. They're in. They're already in, as we are to some degree, to a substantial degree, in their infrastructure. So this is definitely a high noon stalemate situation, which is, it's just a matter of us each flipping switches on each other, turning on the access that is already established. I've been using this term loosely for the lay folks, which is that there's already established plumbing in critical infrastructure in the US and in private sector and in government, can turn on it at will. So unfortunately, rooting out those implants, getting rid of those access points, is a lot harder than patching a vulnerability, which is, unfortunately, we're very late to the game to do that. So yeah, so that's the top of my list. It's just, when are they going to turn on these access points that have already been established that we know about, but we've had a very challenging time getting other people to realize is a reality, or remediate that in advance, which is not as easy as let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, I think you've set the stage for a very riveting episode. And usually I say, before we begin, would you mind telling us a little bit about your background? But it's like we've already covered a vast amount of topics in the introduction. So without further ado, would you mind telling our listeners a bit about your background and what you're working on these days?
Certainly, happy to do it. I'll keep it concise. I've been in this for a very long time. I was in it since when it used to be called InfoSec, before it was cybersecurity. So mid to late 90s is when I really got involved heavily. Believe it or not, my career started as a competitive intelligence professional. So I was hired by my clients to get intelligence for them, to benefit them in a business capacity, essentially help them win deals, bids, primarily overseas. And I was in Emirates, more or less that area during that period of time. Got to know a lot of the community from a cyber perspective, to use that term loosely, in that period. But then I moved to the US in the early 2000s, and around that time is when I made the shift. I moved from being a competitive intelligence consultant to a counterintelligence consultant, because it funny story, but it manifested over the course of a lunch I had with a friend of mine in the industry, fairly well-known luminary at this point, one of the godfathers in cyber. And he and I were talking, and it was post 9/11, and there were a lot of budgets that were being constrained, as we all know. You remember that period where it was very, and he said, and he was literally sitting with me, sushi lunch, and he said, why don't you just call the clients that you already have for competitive intelligence and offer the ability to protect them from guys like you? And I said, I guess that makes sense. He goes, yeah, I mean, there's bound to be others. And I said, yeah, there are. That's not a bad idea. So I literally the next day basically retooled my organization to offer basically countermeasure counterintelligence to the exact methods and procedures and TCPs essentially that I would have utilized against them, to avoid their impact by a contemporary of mine somewhere else, on the other side, right? And it worked out really well, and I did that for effectively the next 10 years as a consultant. And then in 2008 and 9, I got tied up with a group that was part of the whole botnet chasing group, right? This is a very interesting period of time in the history of cybersecurity, where botnets really made their debut to the mainstream. Mariposa was a big one that I think everyone may remember in the community. That was a substantially large botnet, and we were all part of that equation of helping find ways to dismantle it. And one of the ways that was very effective was being able to interdict or infiltrate the command and control component of these threat groups. And by doing so, either A, take it down entirely, meaning shut down the command and control infrastructure, or what I did to do was just to surveil it, sit and watch communications come inbound from the victims that already had malware deployed into their environments, because we were, by inserting ourselves into that part of the threat sort of kill chain, we're able to see which victims are infected by malware, even if they don't know that they are. And so I formed a company around that called Unveillance. That company had a number of adventures. Most notably, I got in a tussle with Anonymous in 2011. Actually, a very specific, or at least what maybe they don't want to claim them as part of them anymore, but they were called lulsec, that caused quite a bit of damage. They attacked Sony and the CIA and PBS and Sony. Poor Sony, they've been through a lot. That was one of the earlier stage attacks that happened. I think Stratfor was also on that list by lulsec, if I'm not mistaken. And we survived that. In fact, we came out on top from that situation where with law enforcement and the intelligence community. And then I sold Unveillance to Mandiant in 2012. Spent about a year and a half there in an intelligence capacity with them. Then I left before FireEye acquired Mandiant. Of course, we're talking about Mandiant 1.0 now, right? Because now there's various iterations of Mandiant that have happened, now part of Google, which
Yeah.
we'll talk about.
And I think we'll
Mhm.
chat about that a bit later
Yeah,
in more depth.
absolutely. And I left. I left about a month before FireEye acquired Mandiant and re-engaged with the industry with Prevailion, basically resurrecting a similar methodology that I just talked about, which is infiltrating command and control. But this time, not merely to identify the victims, but more importantly, identify third-party partners or supply chain partners that could island hop or laterally move from a weaker operational security environment to a more secure one by way of a VPN or a connected trusted connection. So my idea was to preempt that infection movement or can prevail, and we've been at it ever since. So I founded that in 2017, and now we're 4.5, 5. It's been a ride. A lot of consumer education on this issue, to be perfectly honest. So it hasn't been quite as I hoped. I thought by now the entity would have been really well established, that supply chain and all that. And of course, SolarWinds happened, and now they're going to definitely understand how important this is. And unfortunately, yes, they understood the immediately results or a let's get this fixed. It was the rest of the problem. Very slow process. But yeah,
Mhm.
so that's the attempted to be short version of my background, Brendan.
Yeah, you covered about 5 of my questions there, so we're good. You're keeping me off the mic, which is a good thing. So, yeah, I was going to say, like, let's open up with your cybersecurity journey, but I think you covered that quite nicely. So, this is obviously not your first rodeo. You're a two-time founder. Could you maybe unpack a little bit more the evolution from your first cyber company to Prevailion? Like, are there similarities and where do you apply your solution today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's a very interesting path, because as I mentioned, and thank you for kind of allowing me to share some history, because it'll lend a lot of context to the answer here. Competitive intelligence and then moving to counter tools are the same even today. They're all the same thing. All the threat vectors are all the same. Social engineering is still a lock in the good old day, information out of people before you could constructed phishing email. So really, what I've seen just broadly, and then I'll dive a little deeper, is that nothing dramatically shift in terms of the funnels. Best way for me to put it. What I've seen is an acceleration of the velocity by which things happen. That's all that's really
Yeah,
changed in my world.
sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, I've spoken with a lot of CISOs, even ex FBI agent. He was one of the first cyber task force members in the FBI, and he said exactly what you're saying. He hasn't seen anything new in the last 20 years. It's just that the monetization has changed and not getting caught, keeping under the radar.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. And I think that, in particular, what I've watched is the emergence of the defensive cybersecurity space rebrand, reiterate over and over and over again. I mean, I remember when firewalls came out, and I remember when they were non-verbose and they would just do their job. And people would kind of go, is this thing on? And they'd look at it and they'd be like, is it doing anything? And it's like, well, nothing bad's happening. So yes, the answer is, a cybersecurity professional would typically be like, yeah, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You shouldn't hear anything. It's supposed to stop everything and allow you to get on with your job. But unfortunately, human nature requires um, qualification of functionality. And so all the blinky lights and all the alerting started to show up because of that, because they had to justify their value to the world. So unfortunately, the cybersecurity community got very verbose. It was just noisy. Then AV started to scream about how many things they were quarantining, and it got to be a little bit cumbersome. And then just to kind of really fast forward, which I find fascinating, and as it dovetails into what I've seen as a shift, we went from no information in cybersecurity to an overabundance and like a bloat amount of not all useful, by the way, unfortunately, just like IOCs, like indicators of compromise, that terminology. It's now a catch-all for just about anything that could be conceived of as possibly malicious, and it's made it and then of course now today's world, you can't throw a stone without hearing ML and AI applied to IOCs, and it's like, oh god, please guys, let
TMI.
yeah. And it's just like, no, you're not going to be able to throw a computer and resolve all these problems. It's still going to require a human analyst. It's still going to require human instinct on this situation. So what's changed is that now there's an overabundance of information and under a scarcity of talent in the industry to look at data, and a reliance heavily on very kind of catch-all solutions that will hopefully solve the problem. And threat intelligence has gotten, for lack of a better term, it's just it's a echo chamber of the same data over and over. Sorry, I sound like I'm very fatalistic about this, but sadly it kind of is. It's either vulnerability analysis in today's world, or it's some sort of IOC that is don't go nothing really that much dramatically in between there. And that's what I've been trying to fill that gap with quality telemetry that is actionable and related to your environment specifically, so that you can take action, or tied to an environment that you're connected to, so you don't run those risks.
Another common misconception that I think, or maybe it's not a misconception, you can probably speak better to this, but from my understanding, and again, I'm not a cyber expert, but I work in the business for enough time to be dangerous. And what I've understood is that your threat feeds are pretty much useless, because once you have it, it's already old news.
Exactly right. I said this in another interview a long time ago. I haven't said it since, and it's a really worthy statement, which is that the very first people to basically ingest threat feeds are the adversary, because they want to know exactly what part of their infrastructure, or what binaries or malware packages they've deployed have been compromised by the good guys, right? So the very first group to identify that their infrastructure is compromised are the bad guys. So you're 100% correct. The minute it goes public or it's open sourced, you're generally working with post-mortem data or information. So, and we can get into later, if you want, a little bit of how we've been able to combat that.
Definitely. So actually, I would love to take a few minutes to share with us how Prevailion works.
So, as I mentioned, what motivated the foundation of Unveillance back in 2010 was our ability to take over and infiltrate command and control infrastructure of the bad guys. Now, to the listeners out there, I'm sure that the bells are going off and the alarms are going off that this sounds highly offensive. We do get I would say misinterpreted. We get perceived to be a very offensive security type of firm. And while in theory that's correct, meaning we are implicating the infrastructure of the adversaries, we're doing it in a very clever way. We're doing it by getting the command and control environments to be altered and taken down by the authorities. In this case, when I say authorities, I'm not referring to specifically law enforcement, but groups like registrars and DNS providers and whatnot. They're the ones to make those changes based on intelligence and evidence that we supply to them. So that's kind of our magic, is we're able to provide the intelligence they otherwise would not have, to then take action on a command and control environment. And in the old days, they would maybe get a report and it would be considered abusive, and they would then just suspend it, or they'd kind of take it down, and the bad guys would essentially just re-register a fresh C2 domain and off they go. A matter of minutes later, everything's kind of working again. Now, there's work to be done by the bad guys on that part, so they don't like it when that happens, but it's not irrecoverable. I mean, we've seen in history the Emitet takedowns and Zeus and all these other things over the years, where big concerted effort between like law enforcement and Microsoft and others. And it's a worthy effort, but the problem is what it really does is it simply just shifts the adversary to a fresh set of, malware packages, repacked binaries that can be deployed with a fresh set of C2 domains, and they're up and running after thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in months and months of court orders and subpoenas have been, issued, and so it's very asymmetric. The bad guys win in that case. With us, because we're infiltrating their environments, we're much less of a band-aiding approach to the problem. We're more curative. Our goal is to say, here's the origins of where this malware has manifested in these victim organizations. If we can get an IR engagement or some sort of remediation process going to get rid of the actual disease, we can be curative in that way. And then I certainly don't have the time to get into extreme detail, but I'll leave you with this one very important part of it. I just mentioned how open source, and you did too, open source intelligence generally is useless because now the bad guys know about it and it's obsolete. It is, but we have a very unique ability to take that OSINT data. Let's say that it's food.com is a C2 domain associated with, I don't know, let's pick Conti, right? We all love Conti Group now because they're top of the list on ransomware groups. Everyone at least knows about, I should say. If we were able to find that food.com was a Cobalt Strike C2 domain, and if need be, I can explain the Cobalt Strike situation if it makes sense, Brendan. But we can then deliver that to the registrar of record and find all the other domains that have yet to be displayed or disclosed to the rest of the world that the same actor has owned but hasn't shared to the world yet. So Prevailion is generally ahead of the threat. We usually know about latent or dormant C2 infrastructure before it's even activated. So to your point, the win that we provide is the ability to get ahead of the threat before, in some cases, is even deployed. The hard part for us is essentially when we impact it, because we don't want to do it too early because that'll push the adversary off to a fresh registration. We don't want to do it too late because then there's a lot of casualties before we're actually able to stifle it. So hope that made sense. It was a little bit technical, but hopefully it resonates with your audience.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing what you can. I would love to know if it's possible for you to share intel that you've recently uncovered through your product or sources that you could share, anything in terms of trends relative to the Russia-Ukraine situation.
There's a couple things I think that are really worthy of conversation or to be talked about, which is one thing that we predicted that is now manifesting and showing to be the case in our data. It's showing up that we were pretty certain that there would be a lot of coattailing. In other words, as soon as this happened, all the other nation state actors that we consider adversarial would jump into the dogfight, right? They would all take advantage of the opportunity to say, this is the perfect opportunity to start infiltrating or switching on access that they've had in previous times while this is going on, because frankly everyone's just going to blame the Russians on it. This is going to be an easy thing for us to get away with murder, because it's a little bit like looting during a war. You're going to get all the military skirmishes going on, but then there's all these other criminal enterprise mini little gang groups that are going to go and loot stores. And that's kind of similar to what's going on now, is that a lot of other nation state actor known malware lit up in our system around. It was fascinating to see a prediction come to life. So that I don't see that going away, by the way. So this is a little bit of a foreboding situation that this could get ugly pretty quickly, because if it's an onslaught of everyone on everyone, and it's just this worldwide dogfight from a cyber perspective, it's going to be hard to tell who's what, and we could end up in a lot of friendly fire, which leads me to the second thing that we started to see, which we've been seeing a little bit in the headlines, which is the hacktivist volunteer communities that are trying to help in some ways. We're seeing some of that activity show up, which is highly concerning because of the same reasons I mentioned in former conversations, which is they're not working from a position of good intelligence. They're usually going after some sort of target because it seems opportunistic, and that target could result in a much more horrific ramification, which is concerning. So it does appear that there's just a general upward trending in terms of beaconing from malware in environments that we saw that were somewhat in a more dormant state. They would beacon every couple of weeks or every month or two. Now they've amped up, or it sounds contradictory, but it'll make sense when I explain it, or we've seen it decrease. And the decrease is not a cleanup process. It's intelligent control over the malware by the actor to tell it to shut up and lay low until they're called upon, because now they know, the actor knows that everyone's going to be more vigilant, and it could get caught if um, it speaks too frequently, or the cadence of the communication is easy to pattern and get, get discovered. So we're seeing all of those types of TTP shifts based on what's going on with the war, which I think is pretty fascinating. Not to mention, I'm sure some of it does have to do with people amping up their security and their vigilance, that maybe they're catching a few things here and there. But I hate to say it,
Hmm.
we're seeing a massive cleanup effort. I wish I could give some good news on this podcast that this is the perfect opportunity for everyone to root out the evil. It's not happening. Not at a pace or a clip that is actually going to make a difference if we get attacked.
So you mentioned quote tailing. I want to also bring up an article, and you mentioned you've had some encounters with them. Anonymous, shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they mentioned waging war against Russia. Can you speak to any significant impacts due to Anonymous or other vigilante cyber groups?
Sure. So, Prevailion as a technology generally can't see things like denial of service attacks. We're not looking at the outbound, so to speak, attacks onto an environment. We're not looking at the net flow, so to speak, that would give us that indication that that's happening. But our intelligence analysts and a lot of what I do on a personal front, I do monitor a lot of those communications. I do watch a lot of what's being said, trying to figure out what's hyperbole versus what's real in many cases. And a lot of these groups are using things like denial of service, like I just mentioned. That's generally nothing to do with, I mean, it can have something to do with malware, but the stuff we're seeing is not. It's usually someone instigating some sort of attack that way, which is less of a infiltration and espionage approach. But I definitely can say that for a fact. I mean, and maybe I'm going to take this question, answer your question in a little bit of a strange path, but let me know how this hits you. Um, the lauding of the effort by Anonymous and other groups is scary, because while I think maybe there is some proverbial wins, it harkens back to what I foreshadowed earlier, which is that what if they do something that escalates a problem even greater than what they realize they're doing? For example, several weeks ago, and it did hit the news, but it kind of got very quickly covered over. Some group, I'm not sure who it was, did at least allegedly take down some satellite communications in Russia, and I'm not entirely sure in what capacity they did, but what that did was it put Russia on fairly high alert that this could be a nation state actor attacking their satellite reconnaissance capabilities, which would escalate into more of a nuclear alert state. That's terrible, because if this was a rogue group that wasn't, and I highly doubt it was a governmental group, to be honest. They know better than to do something like that, because it will escalate into a hot war, and a really, really hot war that we don't want at all. So that worries me, and that worries me, one. And I am seeing a lot more rhetoric around that we took down control systems for trains. But the problem is, control system for a train in many cases could be very similar to a control system for some other environment that maybe has the same thing. And if they're building something that's wormable, that is intended to attack that, we could end up in a NotPetya situation again, where it proliferates to other environments, not even in the Ukraine, maybe into neighboring countries like Latvia and Lithuania. And then it's cyber. It could end up in the US. It could end up in other parts of Europe and Asia. Very similar to what we saw with Maersk getting infected and FedEx and all that with NotPetya. So that's very, very worrisome. And then, heavy answer, but a little tidbit as a thread to pull. What happens when this all ends and these actors that are working with impunity are blood drunk on their newfound ability to be vigilantes, and they look for a new target? I mean, they've watched all the cyber crime gangs that are now absolutely wealthy, hired because of how wealthy they are. Does that manifest a whole new group that are moving toward that? So there's very concerning things that are kind of in the medium to longer term problems that we're due to face due to happening today.
Just when we thought we were getting a break from COVID. Anyway, speaking of ransomware, you mentioned there was information coming out about this new ransomware during the start of the invasion called Wiperware, which is labeled as pseudo ransomware apparently and has some similarities to which you also mentioned. Can you walk us through what it is and what is its purpose? Maybe it's worth also explaining what NotPetya is, just for some of our viewers who may not know.
Sure, absolutely. Andy Greenberg, I'll go in reverse. Andy Greenberg wrote a very, very good book called Sandworm. If the viewers are interested in looking at that book, that was a very, very well written review and thorough analysis of the situation that happened in the Ukraine back in 2015 or so, when Russian government hackers, essentially from GRU, which is the division within the Russian government that executes on these military intelligence, military cyber division, deployed several sets of malware into the Ukrainian power stations. Started with a very similar thing that we're talking about today called Kill Disk, which literally wiped the machines down, which wasn't looking to encrypt anything. So very quickly, wiper versus ransomware. Ransomware generally encrypts the data of an organization or government or what have you, with a potential to be unlocked to get back. That's the whole promise. Doesn't always work, but they promise to deliver a decryption key if the victim pays the ransom. That's very in short form what ransomware is. Wiper malware, which actually I commented on I'll send it to you, Brendan, after this podcast, in a article about the Iranians starting to employ this 6 months ago. They were notoriously interested in Wiperware because it had no financial benefit to the perpetrator. It was literally there to destroy. It was there to hobble and maim and disrupt. And that's what this is. It doesn't have any means to recover. It's meant to simply destroy. There's no ransom associated with it, generally speaking. They will at times mask it as that, like, we've done this to your systems, pay us this amount. But really what it's done is destroyed everything. There is no remediation. There is no decryption key because it's not encrypted. It's been destroyed. So that's the difference. So this is a much more destructive pursuit, has more of a political agenda usually tied to it rather than a financial one. Best way for me to explain it. It's more of a sabotage utility than it is some sort of extortion utility. That's a better way to explain it.
It seems to tie in with the Russian strategy in their ground offensive right now. They're just bombing
Yeah.
indiscriminately.
Right. Exactly. And what the other thing I've mentioned, and I think it's worthy of restating as well, is everyone also is waiting for the cyber war to start, kind of thing. They want to sort of the fireworks of it, right? And I don't know that we'll ever see it that flagrantly. Back to the sandworm example, it took a series of researchers. Back then, it was Eyesight Partners doing research on the malware that finally figured out what it was, that finally identified this is what was actually impacting Ukraine, that finally made sense of everything. Everything was pieced together in a timeline. But that happened well after the whole event happened. So I think what we're seeing today, many of the events that are manifesting right under our noses, and while we're even doing this podcast, we're not going to know about until there's a post-mortem analysis done by someone at some point later. So we could very well be waging a war right now that we don't even really know, or the attacks could be ongoing that we don't even really understand yet. And people, in the Ukraine are maybe suffering from, they're worried about bombs. I don't know that they're sort of sitting there trying to figure out if it's malware on their system today. You know what I mean? They're contending with a much more dramatic situation, that will result in a lot of things being destroyed that we'll never know about. So there's a good chance that a lot of the cyber activities that we believe maybe didn't happen may have, but the events that happen in symphony with it overshadowed those efforts.
In terms of scale, are you at liberty to discuss the traffic and activity during this invasion? Can you share any numbers just to give our audience
Sure.
sort of a picture of the scale and what's going on?
Yeah, and I think just important note here that because there was a mixture of malware being instructed to go silent, coupled with maybe new deliveries of fresh implants that had retooled infrastructure, we didn't see this like massive, just one massive clean uptick. To give you some sense of numbers with what we see on average about give or take, and I'll give you a time frame. So we look at about a 6-month period of time in our data. That is a fairly arbitrary amount of time, but it's long enough that it allows us to see pattern that we wouldn't see if we only looked at a month, for example, right? So if there's malware that communicates every 2 months, if we're only looking at a month, we'll miss it, right? We'll see one beacon or something like that, and we'll never see a pattern associated. This is actually why malware is so effective against on-prem security devices, because they're looking for pattern and anomaly to a baseline. And when you have a long pattern and a long wave pattern that doesn't give you any sense of visibility, it's very hard to see. So with us, we have a unique advantage of looking at months, if not years, of communication. So we see, give or take, around 10 to 11 million unique IPs every 180 days that are showing evidence of beaconing malicious compromise, beaconing out to command and control. That volume is close to anywhere from 130 to 150 billion beacons over that 180-day period. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And those 10 million IPs equate to somewhere to the tune of anywhere from 30 to 50,000 different organizations, which could be government entities. This is global, of course, not just US. So that didn't change. All that really stayed very consistent. We saw some sort of upticks on some fronts, certain industries, down on others. It's the usual locations you'd expect to see those changes. Things like critical infrastructure, state government. In fact, the state government stuff that we saw, there was a little bit of an uptick, and it looks like it wasn't necessarily Russia, to the best of our knowledge, from an attribution standpoint. By the way, it's worthy of note that attribution is really hard. So we don't try to claim that we know how to do it at Prevailion. In fact, I don't know that anyone really does it that well. If anyone has the means to, it's the government. They have enough intelligence to make that more of a sound judgment on that. But whenever we do get a good, everyone agrees that it's said actor, will generally sort of commit to that as well. Everybody being the likely suspects, the CrowdStrikes, the Mandiants, the Palo Altos, a few other Israeli organizations that we feel are very competent in that regard. But yeah, so I think that set of 30 to 50,000 organizations also breaks down to all 200 or so industry groups, if you look at it from an ISEC or NICS codification. So there's literally nothing that's not compromised, Brendan. I mean, this is the part that is startling, and almost one of these situations where it's hard to even internalize, because it seems insurmountable. And it's unfortunate because it goes along the lines of everything we've heard from all these professionals in the OT and ICS profession, where they're saying we need a good 10 to 20, maybe longer number of years to get us retooled so that we actually are less vulnerable. We're starting so late in the game to try to get that underway. I mean, there's no way we're going to be able to fix while waging a war or defending ourselves. So we're in a very precarious position.
Speaking of precarious position, so what is the solution in your opinion? What can critical infrastructure companies do? What can businesses do based on a combination of your expertise and your intelligence?
Yeah, it's at this stage in the game, it's a triage effort, and I know that's a terrible terminology to use because it kind of brings to mind battlefields where you're stopping the bleeding, and and that's a little bit of what I am. It's the reason I picked that word, because right now the best that we can do is do our absolute best to identify potential lateral movement of things into your environment. So in other words, this supply chain problem is bigger than what everyone believes. While because people have thought, I'm going to build a nice, thick, tall wall and I'll build a moat and we're going to be good, because that's how cybersecurity organizations have generally sold it, is that you can defend yourself. You can armor yourself up enough to where you're not going to be impacted. What they've forgotten is that, not forgotten, what they've just not addressed, I should say, is that you have to have communications with others to do business. There's got to be. And when I talk about supply chain connectivity, people misinterpret that I'm referring to MPLSs and VPNs that are connecting you. No, I'm talking about an email exchange. Brendan, if I'm insecure and you and I have an email exchange, and let's say that I'm part of the Nobelium attacks by China on the exchange servers, and they get into the Prevailion mail servers, and they send you an email from Karim written exactly how I'd write you an email, where maybe you and I have talked a certain way where you're like, this must be him, because one, all of my spam filters are not flagging it because it's coming in and it's passing all the DKIM and utilities that would look for any kind of spoofed environment. And it's written in a way that looks like me. And I'm sending you a PDF to take a look at of my latest article. You're going to click it. I would too. And so the problem is, that is supply chain. That is the same thing as a VPN access to between two environments. So being very vigilant about which organizations maybe already have an infection in advance, so you can limit the exposure to yourself, is first. Because if we can limit exposure, then we can avoid infection, which we can then avoid persistence and lateral place. That's the first step in the equation. Then comes good, solid threat hunting chops to get in and root out those implants, because simply stopping trying to take down command and control environments like what we've seen with Emitet just pushes the adversary to another set. So, and by the way, all this that I'm talking about isn't easy. It does require a talent that we are woefully lacking at the moment. There's just not enough. If anyone's listening here that's just hoping to get into cybersecurity, please join. Because we need everyone we can possibly get at this point. And so it's a manpower issue as well.
You need to speak to the gatekeepers. There's enough folks that want to get in, I can assure you of that.
No doubt about it. And that's the thing, is that there needs to be some kind of good uniform effort. And then the third piece of this, if we're counting here, and this is cliche, but it's a real statement, is good. It's still lacking. The real innovation is happening in smaller organizations like mine, and it's not to promote my own case, talking about everyone that is innovating on a smaller front. If we had the support of a government, collective saying, let's employ this, let's foster it, let's force multiply it into these organizations. I mean this with all due respect to the incumbents, the big guys that have their current security solutions. Right now is not the time for politics. I think we really need to start using what works, and that can come from the strangest places, including smaller organizations.
So you're in favor of decentralized, distributed, real-time threat intelligence sharing?
We'd at least be on par to some degree with the way the adversaries function today. They're more organized, and they're more equipped and more established in their information sharing than we are as good guys. So it's pretty sad when the bad guys have been able to communicate better with each other to align their objectives than we are together as a security group. And that's a sad reality. That just adds the asymmetry of the problem.
Congress put together a bill that requires critical infrastructure companies to report any significant breaches or ransomware within 24 hours. Do you think this is a positive step forward? Do you think this will have an impact?
So, two things. Will they follow the rules? Public organizations, if they know is a big part of it, because in many cases they're innocent in some ways. They're not being subversive, or they're not trying to not follow the law. They just don't know. So first step is the intelligence to understand that they indeed have a active breach underway. And many times that takes a very long time. The average dwell time, and I'm speaking from old numbers here, so I'm sure they're more updated than what I have. Back at least when I was at Mandiant, I mean, we were talking about 200 and some days of persistence in an organization before it was even discovered. That's almost a year.
I think I actually pulled that statistic for one of my presentations a few years ago. We were trying to illustrate the dwell time from an email remediation perspective, because back in the day when we came to the market, there was really no such thing as email remediation at scale, like with a click. There is a pretty much agreed upon statistic that it takes around 80 seconds for someone to click. Now, if you're looking at dwell times of days, weeks, and months, like there's no chance if you aren't able to mitigate or remediate in real time or at scale. So yeah.
No, thanks for adding color there, because that's exactly right. And yeah, you're talking about what's good about what you brought up is that there's the vector, right, and the speed by which the infection can manifest, which is faster than ever now, because for the reasons I mentioned, the social engineering of the phishing emails, the spear phishing efforts are so capable. They're so good. These are groups that are lurking within your environment, reading your emails, becoming you before they ever deploy any kind of emails. So it's almost impossible, especially when you start targeting HR departments and people that are ill-equipped to identify something that could be malicious, especially if it's written perfectly. And even worse yet, when their
If
job is to open the attachments of things, right?
worst case scenarios when they've taken over the email account completely, account takeover, then everything looks normal. It's just them making sure they speak like the person that they're impersonating.
Exactly right. Exactly. So what's going to be very problematic is that once it's in, it is able to persist. And I think, and then aligning with everything I just mentioned in the last, half hour, that malware that gets deployed, and gets a little bit deeper. There's usually some sort of initial vector of infection that usually facilitates a secondary stage of infection that's even more sophisticated. In other words, the first one might be a little bit noisy and loud, and it might even get caught eventually. In fact, we've even seen actors intentionally write that malware, that first stage, to get caught once the secondary stage is deployed. So in other words, the first stage opens the door, the second stage gets in there, and it's a much quieter, much more deeper persisting piece of malware. And then the first stage kind of can almost suicide itself and get itself caught to give the security teams comfort that they caught it and killed it.
I'm curious to understand if SolarWinds and Log4j had anything to do with the plumbing, as you say, for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or was it just coincidental and they're going to leverage those breaches and vulnerabilities that exist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a perfect answer because I don't know whether there was a concerted effort and these were all part of a grand plan. Um, what I can tell you is that SolarWinds was very sophisticated. That was really, at the risk of sounding complimentary. That's not my point here. I'm just the level of sophistication there by signing with a legitimate certificate to make the part of the software from SolarWinds look like that, or the we'll call it malware component to look like part of the software, was very, very ingenious. It was a very, very clever, very and professional way to get this proliferated out to the community. Now, there was subsequent malware that was deployed post the Sunburst infection, which was the very first SolarWinds infection that was deployed. There were subsequent ones, Teardrop, Raindrop, a few others that are out there, and a few others. They're still there, by the way. This is not anything that's been cleaned up. Just for, if the viewers think SolarWinds is over, it's not. It was the doorway to a lot more that happened. Log4j is a vulnerability that was, obviously made massive headlines, as we all remember, over Christmas. Now, how long that vulnerability was, being utilized before it was brought to light is a great question. I mean, I think that there was speculation that it had gone back almost a year. That's a long time to be exploiting something with no detection. So I set the stage on the answer to suggest that whether it was serendipitous or by design, both of those opportunities allowed for massive amounts of deployment of implants by Russians everywhere, in conjunction with all the other things that they had as access points. So it's unfortunate because both of those really allowed for, so SolarWinds was a really good utility to get into a very, very vast number of organizations and then leapfrog to all theirs. So you think about LinkedIn for the viewership here that maybe doesn't know much about cybersecurity. You go to LinkedIn, and used to see your first degree connections. So me and Brendan are connected, and me and X number of others, 8,000 other people or whatever. But then those 8,000 people connect to like another few thousand. So by definition, I'm connected to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. That's that taxonomy, or that's that sort of tree of connectivity that this malware could utilize to get absolutely everywhere, and researchers yet. So we're been established there. Now, to cap this off, tie it off to the question, no idea if this was by design for the Ukrainian situation, but I would find it really hard to believe that it wasn't utilized thoroughly or will be utilized thoroughly for this effort, right now that they have this established.
Can you speak to the success of the anonymous vigilante groups in terms of crippling each other's infrastructure? Is there a lot of chaos? Are both sides getting taken down? Like, what's going on there?
I and my team and others are having the same problem as everyone else, which is deciphering, what's real from hyperbole. Unfortunately, so there's a lot of disinformation in that regard flying around to instill fear or whatever. So it is very difficult to figure out what's real and what's not. But I will tell you that at least with regard to some of the channels that I keep tabs on and some of the conversations I've been having with government and otherwise, I don't know that those vigilante efforts have had a material of this war. They've been disruptive, but not in a way that was stifling or hobbling. Right, I think it was more annoying because it wasn't coordinated. I mean, I'll be honest, it's not because the skills were lacking in some capacity. There's some very talented people that want to assist, and by all means, it would be great if they could assist, but under the right guidance and oversight, because that's the problem. You're never really going to have a dramatic effect when you have disparate efforts hitting random targets. It doesn't feel very coordinated. You really can't do much serious stuff. So I believe what I hear when I hear that, yeah, it hasn't been material. That's believable to me because it's just not coordinated. It's too big of an apparatus to take down if you're not coordinated.
So what are your thoughts on this guy who apparently took down North Korea's internet because he was attacked by one of North Korea's hackers, supposedly? I'm not sure if you're familiar with this story, but what are your thoughts on that? Was he just lucky? Because that was like a lone, a cyber soldier.
Luck always plays a part in this, Brendan. No matter who you are, whether you're government or private sector or a lone wolf, luck is always a part of it. Right time, right place with many of these things, right? Even when you have an established infrastructure and apparatus to use, you still need the right conditions for it to work. So with this individual, again, I saw that story sort of came and it went fairly quickly. I would love to dig a little further into that to sort of get a little sense of credibility around just what he did, because the suggestion was he took the entirety of the internet down for North Korea. That was at least what I remember in the headlines. And of course, I have to take that with a grain of salt with media. He may have done something that they may have misrepresented in the write-up, because that seems a little bit the internet. There's a way to do that, but it's a really dramatic pursuit. And if he had that level of access, I think this individual would be well in the confines of the U.S. government somewhere, where he'd be either helping or assisting whoever. If he had if he had the keys, we'll call it that, right? Because the keys are literal and figuratively the part of the equation here. If you can get some core DNS keys at your disposal to mess with things in an environment, yeah, you could take the internet down. But that's an incredibly challenging pursuit. It requires a very serious amount of coordination. So either he got incredibly lucky and was able to disrupt something substantially, which good for him. But I don't know that that's a repeatable thing and that he had some sort of unique talent that no one else had. I think it was probably an opportunistic situation at best.
Coming back to what you said earlier in the show, you opened up with like Russia is moving to detach itself from the internet, and a couple weeks ago, Russia was removed from SWIFT. Can you speak a little bit to those 2 points and why you weren't happy or optimistic about removing Russia from SWIFT?
Sure. There's a geopolitical challenge with taking an adversary off with you. Like, if we all feed off a similar ecosystem, in this case, Swift, taking Russia off of it, while that's a punishment of sorts, it also introduces the risk now that they don't have a reliance on it because they can shift to China. And China has a backup plan for that kind of situation. And so while it's not perfect, and it certainly isn't going to have the robustness probably of Swift and all kinds of reasons why it made sense to do it politically, from an intelligence and cybersecurity standpoint, you've now removed any reason for them to not attack it. They're going to do it now. You add to this that They may not even do it themselves. They may just unleash Iran. Iran's not on it either. They've been off, what, 8 to 10 years now. So in other words, they don't even necessarily have to do it. They can literally just inspire someone else to do it that has as much of a vested interest in seeing us go down, maybe even more. Because you think about the political motivations of these various nation state actors against the West. Some are, politically motivated. Like it's well known that the intelligence services of China are interested in the intellectual property, or at least they were until they harvested most of it already from the U.S. Russians were heavily involved in the financial crime and fraud and ransomware efforts. Iran really just wanted to disrupt and take down. There was less of a motivation around financial. So when you start looking at the core motivations of these groups, if two of the three, and China really doesn't care because they have their own, are off a system that we rely on heavily, we've now made it a target. And that bothers me a lot. And then the decoupling part of this, with Russia sort of cordoning themselves off and building a walled garden environment around their internet, means that they then, in a similar situation to the Swift problem, there's no reason to leave the rest of the internet up and running for everyone else to benefit from if it doesn't benefit them. It's quite simple.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. Everyone was pretty much on their knees when Facebook went down for like a few hours a few months ago. So that was a little taste of what could be.
And about a week ago, Brendan, do you remember when Down Detector showed all the cloud providers all having a spike of downtime all at once? I don't know if you caught that. It was a blip, let's call it that, but it was a very scary blip in my opinion, because Azure and DigitalOcean and Cloudflare all have a similar level of downtime all at once at the same moment. To me, is way too serendipitous, way too concerning to be coincidental. So I'm not being foreboding. I don't know. This is not meant to be fear mongering, but I'd be very curious on how that happened. If we can get some explanation around that, that would be wonderful. Because to me, when I see completely disparate providers all have a similar event manifest like that, uh, far be it from me to claim this is the reality, but that feels like a test.
Time will tell, as they say. Fingers crossed. So I know we're coming up for time, so I wanted to end off here maybe with a couple more questions. So you spoke about Google and the acquisition of Mandiant, a previous acquirer of one of your companies. What do you think the strategy is there by Google, and are you happy or impartial to the acquisition?
Yeah, I've definitely been talking about this a lot last few days, definitely. And one, I'm happy for the Mandiant team members that I know very well. I'm happy for Kevin for a good outcome here, certainly. And I think that, as far as a mothership for Mandiant, Google is a very interesting one. I think there was confusion for many about why Google would do something like this, because Mandiant is at its heart a consultancy and a service-based organization, while Google is a software company. Primarily, right? And I think that really was quite confusing. But the more that we hear about the reasoning, which is that Google really does want to take a very strong position in the market with threat actor analysis and attribution and T analysis, Mandiant is the best as you're going to get with that kind of thing. They really do know what they're doing, and I think that leveraged with the power of Google's immense amounts of telemetry, if they do really effectively blend the two capabilities together, meaning the access to immense amounts of quality data with extremely skilled talent to look through that data and parse through it and identify risk. Because there's the consolidation of the industry has been happening. Microsoft has been on a massive effort to build up their security apparatus. That's a huge part of them in recent times. So everyone's doing it. I'm not surprised to see those two brands merge. Right, those are two massively powerful brands, each in their respective space. So that alone is a formidable concept. I think it's just now how they're gonna. The magic will be in execution, as always. The idea was great on paper. How well this manifests in reality is yet to be seen. We've seen Mandiant ingested by FireEye, which I think just probably as successful as everyone wanted it to be when it happened. While this has a completely different, intention, and it could very well be very timely. So we might be seeing the right kind of company at the right time, hopefully. That's my optimistic view of it at this point.
I could speak with you for hours. I really appreciate your time in this discussion. It's been fascinating. Before we wrap up here, is there anything else you would like to add that you think we might have missed?
Oh, we covered a lot, Brendan. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's, obviously, I think you said it several times now. This all changes from one day to the next. It always has in cybersecurity. So this is nothing new for guys in the industry like us, knowing, this is par for the course. We knew what we were getting into, but we are in unprecedented times now. And I think that, the fact that I said back in 2010 during some media interview was that it's going to take some sort of real compelling situation for it to finally have an impact on the mainstream for people. When, I hate to say it, but it's going to take a light switch not turn on one day for the mainstream to really feel like cyber is a real issue. I feel that we're getting dangerously close to that stage of this becoming a real thing, which is highly concerning. So don't want to leave the whole audience feeling, down the whole day with what can we do to help. There's very little that the average individual can truly do. It's hard. I get that question a lot, is what can the average person do? It's too complicated to really give a single answer there. But what I would say more to the audience that's listening that wants to contribute to this effort in some way, people that have a vested interest in seeing something happen, go through the proper channels. Try to get in touch with organizations. Reach out to me. I'm happy to help guide people that are interested in helping, but get them into the right conduits so that the efforts don't go to waste, because this isn't about trying to control these individuals. This is about making sure that, as I mentioned, a well-organized, concerted, well-led effort that can actually make a meaningful difference in a defensive capacity. Leave the offensive for the governments to do. Don't tangle with that. That's actually an illegal thing to do. It may not be talked about very much now because we're in the throes of a war, but it'll get picked up eventually, and that kind of effort will get law enforcement on you, unfortunately, if you try to do anything, even if it's well-intentioned. So I would leave the audience with that one thought here if they're contemplating running a DDoS attack from their house or something crazy. So please don't do that.
Don't try this at home.
Right. Exactly.
Awesome. So speaking of which, if people want to connect with you, what's the best way for folks to get in touch?
Sure. So I really live on two primary platforms, which is LinkedIn and Twitter. So Brennan, if you put that in show notes, I'll probably be good to put those two in there. I do have my own podcast that I'm going to have Brendan on soon as well, called the Introverted Iconoclast, which we talk about all kinds of things, not just cybersecurity. That we obviously dovetails into that, but I think it would be fascinating to hear Brendan's story there. So that's another area that you can get a hold of, and maybe we can put that in the show notes as well.
And I highly recommend Karim's podcast. I binged it, I think, in one sitting. So keep up the good work. I haven't seen any releases for a while, so I think you've been busy.
I have. There's a lot of backup here. I've got a lot of work to do to get them all, organized and mastered and uploaded. But yeah, there's some good ones coming up.
I'm excited for the next one. So thank you again, Karim. It's been a pleasure. And to the rest of you, thank you for tuning in to Cybersecurity Heroes. That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing or following through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening on Apple Podcast, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.